As I mentioned, it is still Easter. We're still focused on really the most important event that ever happened. And I don't say that as an exaggeration, but I think it really is true that the resurrection, the death and resurrection of Jesus was the most important thing that ever happened. It's the hinge on which history turns. It changes the way that things happen in the world. It changes the way that we see the world, but not just the way that we see the world. It changes the way the world is. It's good news. It's good news that Jesus defeated sin and death. That death is not the end for us anymore, and we know that because we've seen it. We've seen it happen. We've seen that Jesus came back from the dead, and so death is not the end for us. And we've also seen the way that the Spirit of Jesus transforms people's lives and frees people from those things that would hold them back. That it doesn't make us perfect, right? It doesn't make us perfect, but it makes us qualitatively different than we otherwise would be. And see, this is good news. It's not good advice. I'm not up here to convince you that you should adopt a certain set of doctrines, that you should follow a certain kind of philosophy, that you should employ certain principles in your life in order to work a little harder and be a little better. That's not it. It's good news. It's that things are different. When Peter and John go before the authorities, the reason that they're going before the authorities, that we don't get in chapter 3, we didn't read chapter 3, what happens in chapter 3 is Peter heals a man. Right? He heals a man. They're going up to the temple, and there's a man that's been handicapped for his whole life. And Peter says, "Silver and gold I have none, but what I have I give you in the name of Jesus Christ. Get up and walk." And the guy is healed. And of course, this is scandalous. This is scandalous in Jerusalem, that there would be another power bringing healing and wholeness to people. That there would be another authority that would change people's lives. This is scandalous. So they drag Peter and John in because they're a threat. They're going to upset the religious and political order. You can't be doing these things, the authorities say. You can't be doing this. What authority do you have to do this? And they're like, all we got is what we've seen, is what we've heard. All we have is the Spirit of Jesus. That's what we've got. But that is what enabled this man to walk again. That's what is changing the world. And it's news. It's not advice, it's news. This is happening. And I think it's hard for us sometimes to kind of wrap our minds around that. As we live in 21st century America. There is all kinds of good advice out there. Go to the self-help section in your local bookstore. Go to the self-help section on Amazon.com. There's all kinds of good advice out there. But see, this isn't advice. When Peter says that there's no other name among mortals by which we must be saved, Peter's not making some kind of a claim about you have to have the right theology. He's saying Jesus is the one that overcame death. That's the way it happened. It's not that you have to adhere to a certain set of doctrines. That's not what he's saying. He's saying this has changed the world. And I think it's hard for us to think of it that way, because we tend to think of it as, well, it's important that we all believe the right things, and then we get nervous. In our culture, we get nervous. We go one of two ways. Most of us probably go the way of, well, we can't really say exclusive, religiously imperialistic stuff like that. We can't say that Jesus is the only way. We can't do that. That disrespects other religions, and there's truth and beauty in other religions, so we can't say that. Or we go the other way and say, either you believe exactly like we do, or there's a really warm place you could end up with, and it's not going to be pretty. Brothers and sisters, that is a false choice. That is a false choice. I think the Spirit of the living Jesus frees us from either being dogmatists or from being anything goes. Those are not the only choices that we have. Because we're not talking about making people believe some kind of doctrine. We're talking about Jesus has risen and changed the world. I think sometimes maybe you've heard this, that like the good news, the gospel is like somebody gives you a check for $1 million. And you have this $1 million check. But it doesn't do you any good unless you go and put it in the bank or cash it, right? Have you heard this? If you haven't, now you have. No extra charge. So the gospel is like this $1 million check that you get, but you have to put it in the bank. And the analogy is, well, Jesus has died and risen, and we have to believe in order to take advantage of that. Now, there's some truth to that, right? We will not, on this earth, have the full benefit of the Spirit of Christ if we don't trust Christ. That's true. But see, I think a better analogy of what's happened in the death and resurrection of Jesus is not that you've been given a check. A better analogy is the end of World War II. So it's the end of World War II. The Allies have defeated the Axis. That system of evil has been broken. Okay? It's a fact. It's done. The world has changed. But you might remember the story of some people like Hiro Onoda and Taro Nakamura. These were those Japanese soldiers that one guy was out in the jungle in the Philippines until the early 70s. Nakamura was in the jungle in Indonesia until the early 70s too. Now, was the war over? Was the war objectively over? Yes. Did that in fact make a difference to them even though they would not accept that the war was over? Indeed it did, because there were not bands of soldiers hunting them down in the jungle, right? That wasn't happening anymore, because for everybody else the war was over. Yeah, and Ando would come in and do his little guerrilla raid some days, and the cops would go after him. But then he'd go back into the jungle, and that would be that. The war wasn't still happening. So it was different. It was objectively different. Now it's true. His world changed despite his belief, his wrong belief that the war was still going on. And it drastically changed when eventually he did believe that the war was over. Right? Once he believed the war was over, once his former commanding officer from Japan came into the jungle and said, "The war is over, here's your orders, you're going home." Wow, when he believed that, that was when things drastically changed for him. But my point is that reality still changed even though he didn't recognize it. And see, that's what happens with the gospel. That's what happens with the good news that Jesus is alive. Even people who don't believe, even people who have not decided to follow Jesus, their lives are different because of the truth of the gospel. Just ask the people in the village in India where we drilled that well. Do you think that their lives are qualitatively different because of some Jesus followers in Vernon, Connecticut? I dare say that they would say yes. And that's the thing. It's news. Because of that news, we are changed, and the world has changed. We don't have to get into arguments with people. We just have to share as Peter and John, to share what we have heard and seen, the goodness of God. Thanks be to God.